Talk to me about the day-to-day life of you and your husband throughout his enlistment.
Was tough. He was during Vietnam when Johnson escalated the war. Marines were deployed sometimes every other year. And when he came home and told some of the stories that happened, it was, I would literally cry, even though I didn't know any of these young men who had been killed. Ralph was on what they called a search and destroy mission one day, and the Viet Cong would float down the river with rods in their mouths so they could breathe. And one of them came out of the river and shot at Ralph and his troops, killed a 17-year-old boy. His stomach was totally opened. He died in Ralph's arms crying for his mother. The stories of horror are indescribable as to what happened to these young men, which certainly didn't help my view that the Vietnam War needed to stop. And one of his times at home from Vietnam was assigned the job of telling families their sons had been killed. So for a year, that was his job. He went out with the chaplain, horror stories of father having a heart attack when Ralph told him his son had been killed, of a very religious family throwing the American flag at Ralph because they didn't want their son to join. In that year, he went from having brown hair to being totally gray. It was a horrible assignment for anybody to have to do.
Describe some of the harder parts of experiencing war that you or your husband went through.
And when he was overseas, every time there was a knock on the door or the doorbell rang, you never knew if it was going to be a Marine and a chaplain to tell you your husband had been killed. So doorbells or door knocks were not pleasant for us because we didn't, otherwise, because we didn't know what was on the other side of that door. The Marines are very good to families, very, very good. There is nothing they won't do for us. So I felt a lot of support when he was gone if I needed it. He had 2 children. I remember your father seeing Life magazine with a picture of a dead Marine on the cover, and your father becoming absolutely hysterical because you couldn't see the face of the Marine. You could just tell he was dead. But families had to deal with these articles in magazines and newspapers that our children saw as well, and I think had an incredible impact on their ability to survive this whole experience.
Did you agree with the way that the propaganda was shaping the war in Vietnam?
No. You have to remember that in order for President Johnson, under the direction of General Westmoreland, to continue sending more and more troops, the propaganda as to what would happen if we lost the war was horrible. It was, we are saving all of these people in South Vietnam. In the meantime, they're getting burned to death. They're being killed by explosives. And guess what? We lost the war.
How did your opinion on the war shift or change over the course of the war?
It never changed. I thought it was the most useless, senseless thing we could do.
Can you describe the dynamic of the household during the Vietnam War?
So the dynamic of the household when he was away was quite calm. We lived a very normal life. When he would come home, and he may be home for a year, 2 years before he went back, there was incredible stress that came home with him. And you could feel the stress, you can feel the tension, very explosive reaction to things that before he ever went to Vietnam would never have been so explosive. But he carried with him all these horrible things he had seen. If, let's say, you got a splinter in your hand and you complained about it, he would explode and give us stories about, I just held a young man whose stomach was pouring out of his body and you're complaining about a splinter. The household became very, very tense. And he knew he had to go back, so that didn't make it any easier. I'll tell you that there was a sense of relief, and this is a horrible thing to say, when he actually had to leave, because you could breathe a sigh of relief that things could return to almost normal.
Did you carry guilt for feeling that way?
No, not a minute. No.
How did you come to house widows of American soldiers?
It was very interesting because a lot of the families, the widows, had been here with their husbands before they went to Vietnam. And then, if the husband was killed in Vietnam, these were families from the Midwest or Deep South, and they had nowhere to go. So we would take them in until arrangements could be made by the Marine Corps to get them back and all of their things to wherever they lived. We also did something that I consider one of the best things I've ever done. We lived in Sacramento. There was a naval hospital in San Francisco, and we requested that 12 sailors who were hospitalized with multiple amputations be allowed to come to our home where we would entertain them for a weekend, and they were allowed to come. These were men who lost either an arm and leg, or in one case, they lost an arm and both legs. They, as I prepared for them to come, I went to a local hotel and told them that I was bringing these Navy amputees to our home, and I wanted to pay for all of these rooms because they came with doctors and nurses, and the hotel would not let me pay for anything. I will tell you a hysterical story. As I was preparing for them to arrive, there was a knock on my front door, and there was a quite lovely woman, probably in her 50s. She was asking me if I would like to have a prostitute for each of the boys while they were here. She was actually a madam. I thought it was a brilliant idea. I thought nothing we did would be as great for these guys as her sending these women. But some of the wives were insulted by it and said they wouldn't help me prepare if I allowed them. And I said, well, thank you, but I am allowing them. So if you don't want to help, that's fine also. As it turns out, there was a dance held for the guys, and these prostitutes came, and for the guys in wheelchairs, they just jiggled the wheelchairs. I remember dancing with a man who lost an arm and a leg, and he had a prosthetic leg, and I stepped on it and said, I am so sorry. And he said, don't worry about it, I have another one back at the hotel. Their attitudes were unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Did they express their sentiments to you about the war?
You know, I kept up with some of them for several years, actually. I had never heard one, not one, say he wouldn't do it again. A lot of them wanted to go back with their prosthetics on. They, of course, couldn't. But no, I never heard one complain about.
Was that shocking to you?
I think, in a way, I wanted at least one to say this is a useless war, kind of to make my feelings about it whatever, but no,